The goal is to identify the sources which are causing the harm.
The misconception for a lot of people is that in some way the lung is a filter for the air that we breathe.
The lung is an incredible organ. The way I rationalize this is I think of a seesaw, and on one side you've got the particulate pollution, and on the other side you've got the body's natural defense mechanisms. We now know that breathing poor air quality for certainly long periods of time can lead to damage of all our organs. The chemistry between the chemicals and the biologicals. Wow, can imagine what might be going on there.
What's PM 2.5 and why should I care?
PM 10, PM 2.5, ultrafine particles. We can't see them. We do imagine them.
Is it possible to measure what these things are made of?
It is possible, but it's expensive.
Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Frank Kelly, Professor at Imperial College London and Director of the Environmental Research Group. I don't think I'm overstating this when I say Frank Kelly is a titan of building and environmental science. For over 3 decades, he has been the architect of London's modern understanding of air quality, having led the world-renowned Environment Research Group, ERG, from King's College London to its current global hub at Imperial. His career is defined by a rare ability to bridge the gap between microscopic toxicology and macro-level urban policy, making him a pivotal advisor to both the UK government and World Health. Some of his most significant contributions lie in his pioneering work on the oxidative potential of particulate matter. While most of the industry was focused simply on the mass of pollution or speciation, he championed the idea that the true danger lies in the particle's ability to trigger harmful free radical reactions and deplete antioxidants in the lungs. This free radical perspective has transformed how we evaluate the toxicity of everything from diesel exhaust to wood smoke. By proving how these pollutants cause cellular damage and respiratory inflammation, he provided the scientific backbone to London's most ambitious public health interventions, including the Congestion charging zone and ultra-low emission zone. I have been personally increasingly interested in this, and we have been circling each other for a time to sit down for over a year, so strap in. This is an absolutely fascinating episode on a pollutant much talked about, but perhaps little understood at a fundamental level. Don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Frank Kelly. For me, the more philosophical question is how do we balance raising the nuance of that conversation without overcomplicating it for people in the same breath? You know, that we struggle to get people to kind of wrap their head around PM 2.5, for example. You know, it's a number, it's easy to remember, but it doesn't mean a lot to anybody. If you had kind of thoughts on that about, you know, finding this balance between what's actually important to tell people and oversimplification of PM.
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately the goal, is to identify the sources which are causing the harm, because it's unlikely that they all are equally harmful, and therefore that then gives you the information required to deal with those sources in a more strenuous manner. And by doing that, then you're taking the most toxic component out of the system. So the regulation really has to be directed, but to direct the regulation, you need that basic understanding.
Yeah, and I suppose that's where the disassociation comes from for people with all sorts of these air quality metrics, doesn't it? That invariably they're numbers, you know, whether it's an AQI or a PM level or a CO2 level, and we kind of fixate on thresholds or numbers that mean it's good or bad or green or yellow or purple on a scale or something. But then we struggle to get people to translate that to sources and behaviour. And I think that's where the risk is the simplification for communication's sake and the unintended consequence of disassociating it from agency.
You hit the nail on the head directly. It's simplification of communication. That's why we're at this point in time. But even so, we realize that that simplification often is still confusing. So there is a real requirement for better explanation and for the perfect communication, while at the same time, on the other side of the equation, we do need to understand the sources which are most toxic, so we can then get regulation in place to deal with those primarily.
Let's break this down for people then. We talk about, but predominantly this conversation is about particulate matter.
Yes.
Okay, and we talk about particulate matter in general communication in micron sizes. That's how we've got used to describing it in the public face. Let's start there. What are we talking about when we talk about PM10 and PM2.5 and PM1? What's your kind of elevator pitch for that to people when people are asking, Frank, what's PM2.5 and why should I care?
I would say that these different terms obviously refer to different sizes of particles, and the reason that we concentrate on size is because these particles are able to enter our lungs. If they're bigger than PM10, 10 microns, then they'll get trapped in our nasal cavity or our mouth if we're mouth breathing. So we only worry about those that are smaller than PM10. Now, why do we then say PM2.5? Well, obviously they're 4 times smaller, but that means that they can go deeper into our lung. So they have more chance of actually causing injury in the deeper lung. And then, of course, we've got the ultrafine particles, which are 0.01 of a micron. They're smaller again, and they're the ones which we think can get right to the deepest part of the lung and probably cross the lung barrier into our systemic circulation. And if they do that, or what they carry on their surface can do that, and we'll get into that in due course, then they can get anywhere in the body. And all the modern research suggests that when we were concentrating on the lung 30 years ago as being the target for pollutants that we breathe in, that was just the tip of the iceberg. We now know that breathing poor air quality for certainly long periods of time can lead to damage of all our organs.
I've had this conversation with a few people. I think the misconception for a lot of people is that in some way the lung is a filter for the air that we breathe. And our bodies have got pretty sophisticated protection mechanisms for our environment. You know, the dermis of our skin, you know, our digestive system, all of these have really complex processes for protecting us against nasty things. But the mistake with the lungs is that it's actually an open door, it's an open system. It's designed to absorb primarily gases so that we can live and get rid of carbon dioxide. But in the same breath, it's also pretty great at absorbing other things we might not want. And you know, one of my best explanations for that for people is an inhaler. Most people see people using inhalers, and one of the reasons it's so effective is it you know, vaporizes medicine down to a small micron size and enables that medicine to hit the lungs and get into the bloodstream and do what it needs to do really effectively. So, you know, our lung is an open door, and you know, it can absorb this stuff, can't it?
The lung is an incredible organ. I mean, first from a surface size point of view, a couple of tennis courts. I mean, in our chest, that surface area is available for the oxygen to go into our body and for the carbon dioxide to come out of our body. And in a healthy person, this happens very, very effectively. But then if you've got other components riding along on that journey, and if they're small enough, they can get into your body as well. Because as you say, it is an open door.
So when we say those other components, you know, when we imagine particulate matter, we kind of imagine things, dust, soot, carbon, stuff, solid things, or perhaps even fluids, but things floating in the air. But it's more complex than that, isn't it? That those things, even if they're solid, can be made of all sorts of things. And then, as you kind of intimated, they also carry guests with them. They might soak up chemicals or metals and so on. So particulate matter, when we say PM, we're talking about it like it's a single entity, but it's far from it, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you started off that conversation with saying, we imagine. And that's one of the crucial things, because anything we're talking about here this morning, PM10, PM2.5, ultrafine particles, we can't see them. Yeah. So we do imagine them. When we think about them or we talk about them, we're imagining these particles. And if we imagine them in the right way, then they are little spheres, primarily, in many cases, of carbon. Think about your printer. The text is printed in usually black, and that's coming from the carbon of tiny particles of carbon which is being shot onto the paper. Now that carbon is pure. It's manufactured as pure carbon. But when we get carbon coming from, say, a combustion, when we burn coal or oil or wood, then we're still getting carbon particles because they're all carbon-based, but they've got a whole array of different guests on their surface and embedded within them. And those guests really go across the whole periodic table. We know that there's metals of every sort, we exotic ones, things simply that are very toxic to us as a human, as well as other gases which sort of are hitching a ride on their surface, and depending on what the temperature is, they'll maybe stay there or maybe they'll come off in warm environments. So the particle itself is, as it's produced in the first place and then moving through our environment, it could be picking up other components, it could be losing components, and so it's an ever-ending change depending on the exact environment that particle finds itself in, and then ultimately as it moves into your body.
So in my head, I'm kind of picturing a meteor kind of flying through space and it hitting stuff and other stuff hitting it, and so things on the surface of that meteor, right? Is that the wrong mental picture? I mean, are we talking about gases and heavy metals and other chemicals like physically hitching a ride with these carbon particles, or are they kind of attaching at a chemistry scale? Like are they bonding as happens with air chemistry, or is all of the above applies, that you're getting a whole mix of everything going on?
I think it's the latter. It's everything applies, and it depends on the environmental situation. And just to try and illustrate that, if we think about an indoor environment, say our home, say maybe there is a wood burner in the living room and it is lit and it's producing particles, some of which are entering the room itself, because you can usually smell when wood is burning. Those are exotic carbon-based particles with certain metal components and gaseous components associated with that particular type of wood and the temperature that wood is being burnt at. But then imagine if you then start to clean the surface of the table. So you're using a modern cleaning agent, which you can smell as well because they like us to, that limonene flavor smell. Imagine then those particles from that cleaning agent coming in contact with the particles from the wood burning. What you're going to get then is your meteor.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that. And I mean, there was a couple of things that were popping into my head. One was is carbon the only thing that's happening? Because you also hear of things like sand dust, so like dust from and construction particles. There's tires and discs, metal brakes. By the sea, you've got salt. Particles, the actual stuff that's up, and also you've got biological particles, I'm guessing as well, breakdown of skin cells, bacteria, viruses, mold spores, like pollen.
Yeah.
And while some of these are much bigger than the fine particles that we're talking about, they can get ground down and changed. So while they might start as a pollen, which might be greater than 10, it might not end its life that way. It can end up, particles can change. There's what's the word I'm looking for? Not engineering, but physics going on in the space where stuff is actually changing its composite, its sheer size, just from the nature of being suspended, resuspended, ground, bashed against,
There's a great example of that was in Barcelona. It's probably 15 years ago now, but basically it was early spring and it was pollen season, and there was a thunder and lightning storm, and the following day the hospitals were full of people with respiratory conditions, especially asthma exacerbations, etc. And it was subsequently worked out that mass increase in people attending clinics was due to the lightning breaking apart the pollen. So the pollen was initially a certain size, but the lightning itself was splitting it up into much, much smaller components, and they're very allergenic. So these were reaching other parts of the lungs, which they wouldn't normally, the full pollen wouldn't normally have got to. So yes, you not only have the chemistry going on, but you may have the physical stuff going on as well.
Yeah, and I've heard that with mold as well, that you could, that mold, you can end up with fragments of the spores that the body still recognizes as a foreign yeah, and reacts to. So while it might not be a complete mold spore, it's reacting, and if that's ground down fine enough, that's finding its way as well into the system, and the body's reacting to that in some way. So like physically, there's a lot going on. I mean, the space, the air we're breathing is an incredibly complex space, just from the physically what's happening to these particles and the sheer number of sources. I mean, the kind of sense is that the risk is in the dust itself, that in some way it's building up in the lungs and causing, coal miners' cough or something, right? But that's not what we're talking about primarily here. We're talking about what that stuff's made of and its impact on the body. Yes. And that's where it gets complicated again, isn't it? Because as you were saying, that this could be anything from sea salt, right, which we know is relatively harmless, to heavy metals from brake discs. The bandwidth of potential harm that is floating in the air is enormous.
I mean, if we go back to the beginning of this conversation where we were talking about, we report particulate pollution on a mass basis. And one of the reasons that's done is because it's easier to understand, I suppose, than talking about it in other ways. So, but really what is important here, it's not the mass, it's the physics, it's the chemistry, and it's the biology. So it's all of those things which actually are needed to understand which sources, going back to those sources, which sources are the really problematic ones for us as humans.
As is on the back of my T-shirt, the dose is the poison as well. Like it's a small interaction with something very harmful may not cause you a lot of harm, but a heavy interaction with something less harmful might cause you more harm because of the dose that you're exposed to. So it's not only what it is, it's how much of it you come into contact with. And that will vary hugely depending on how close you are to a source of that pollutant as well. And plenty of cases in London of people being exposed to consistently high levels of traffic pollution, for example. That's, we saw the death of Ella Adu-Kissi-Deborah as a result of exposure to traffic pollution. No doubt particulate matter and sources of exposure were contributed to that. So this stuff matters. You can be put into a position where you are exposed to levels of pollutants that are going to cause the body harm.
The way I rationalize this is I think of a seesaw. And on one side, you've got the particulate pollution. We'll use that as the main challenge. And on the other side, you've got the body's natural defense mechanisms. And we do have defense mechanisms, including our immune system. So when the dose goes up, then that seesaw goes like that. And it really depends how good your defenses are as to when you start seeing the effects of that change in the seesaw.
Yeah.
And that brings us on to really what is going on when those particles get into our lung, because it's quite an interesting story, and it's a bit like a war zone in some instances. But we can get into that in due course.
Yeah. Let's get into that in a moment. I think the other interesting thing here is that if we move away from the simple measurement of PM through size, and we start caring about what it's actually made of, how practical is it as of today to work out what it is? Because we see low-cost sensors that are using lasers and light scattering to figure out how many particles are in the air or what size they roughly are, and they're making some broad calculations to figure that out. So you've got everything from low-cost PM sensors all the way to kind of near reference grade sensors, I suppose, that are using light scattering to actually count particles and bin them. But they're still just counting the thing. They're not speciating it in any way. Practically today, is it possible to measure what these things are made of, and how hard a process is that to be able to scoop up a volume of air and then actually be able to tell what's in it?
It's very, very feasible, but it's very expensive. So we have, in London, we've got the London Air Quality Network, over 120 monitors across the 33 boroughs. So fantastic network, tells us how much we're breathing from a mass point of view or from a number point of view. But if we want to know what we're breathing, then we've got 2 stations in London. We call them super sites. One of them is on Marylebone Road, a very busy road in central London, and the other is out at Honor Oak Park on the playing fields beside a school. No real traffic sources near it. So it's a background site and a roadside site.
So in London, but not directly next to a source, and then in London, right next to a source. Right
next to the source, which we have worried about for decades, traffic.
Yeah.
Now, in Marylebone Road, we've got about £2 million worth of equipment. But that equipment tells us, as that bus goes past, that it's a diesel bus. It tells us what type of diesel it's been filled with that morning, and that's from the signatures of all the metals and components of the particles that we were talking about earlier, that mixture on the surface of the particle. And it'll tell us whether that bus has braked within the vicinity of the site, because again we'll get signatures coming from the brake discs, and it'll tell us what type of tires is on the vehicle, because all these tires from different manufacturers, they've all got their own specific chemical signature. So it is possible, but it's expensive.
Is it necessary? I imagine there's huge value from a research perspective of speciating, understanding those chemical signatures of everything that's going on around you. Is that something that should be happening more widely, or are the 150 stations giving you enough information to tell you what you need? Because like sometimes in life, you know, we can overcomplicate stuff. At the end of the day, if there's a lot of particles in the air and they're peaking during rush hour, we can make a pretty good guess at what those particles are going to be made of. Likewise, if we've got a particle counter in a kitchen and it spikes during dinner time, there's a good chance we know what the source is. So at one end of the scale, sometimes the solutions don't need the really precise measurement. We need to figure out how to stop that happening or protect ourselves from that risk, don't we?
So there are two stories here.
Yeah.
The first story is we need the really intense monitoring to tell us what the sources are and what the components are in those sources, because that then allows us to decide whether that source or sources are problematic from a health viewpoint. So what we've done in the past is we've compared the particles at Marylebone Road, understood their chemical signatures on a mass basis with particles at Honor Oak Park. And we were able to definitively show that these particles coming directly from fresh traffic are much more toxic than the particles over here. So that, once you have that information, then that allows you to say, we need to do something about traffic and the sources of particles from fresh traffic if we're going to reduce the health impacts. On the other side of the story, we do need monitoring on a wider scale at a less sophisticated manner, because on the days that there is higher pollution because of the weather conditions or because the Netherlands are spraying all their fields with fertilizer and it's come over, we need to be able to tell people, look, the pollution is worse today. If you're an asthmatic, make sure you've got your inhaler with you. Kids, maybe, don't let them go and run around the playground today, do something inside instead. So it's two different stories.
Yeah. And I guess it's also really powerful for evidencing the efficacy of things like low emission zones. You're able to show over time the change in the composition of the air. And that's what happened in London, didn't it? That you were able to demonstrate through research the risk and associate that with the epidemiological outcomes that were happening. And you've been able to show the impact that has at a chemical level, at a particulate level, following the ULEZ. And I think the last time I spoke to you is you were saying we're now starting to see the epidemiological outcomes, which are the downstream effects that, we're able to say, here's a problem, here's the evidence to show how harmful it is, here's an action, here's the results, like this, we can demonstrate that we're seeing a reduction in pollution, and now you're seeing the downstream impacts of the epidemiological benefit.
Absolutely. So the most powerful piece of work I think we have undertaken in our sort of journey is we were able to show that children living in East London who were being exposed to a lot of traffic pollution, heavy traffic pollution, just simply from where they lived, how they went to school, at the school playground, they were being exposed to a lot more pollution than children living outside London. And whenever we followed their growth, and particularly their lung function, we were able to show that was slower than the children who weren't being exposed to the traffic pollution, even though they were living, similar sorts of lives, eating similar sorts of diets, etc., just normal kids. And when we published that data and took that to the GLA, that was really the piece of work I think that made them push forward with the ULEZ, because it was very clear that just simply living in London was having this restrictive effect on children's lung development. And there's very good data in other situations that if you have a poor start to life and don't attain your full lung growth, which by the way stops, around the sort of the teenager days, you live with that lung the rest of your life. And if you've got a smaller lung than you should have, then you're much more susceptible to other problems later in life. So it was a really strong piece of evidence which allowed the policymakers to make some difficult decisions about curbing traffic.
And for international listeners, the GLA is the Greater London Authority. So that's the authority that looks like it's the mayor basically.
Yes.
And the organisation looks after Greater London.
Yes.
London as a whole. And the ULEZ is the ultra low emission zone. So this is effectively an area in central London where there's significant limitation on combustion vehicles.
Well, it's even extended beyond that now. It started in central London in that congestion zone area, and then it was expanded out to what we call the North and South Circular, which is about half of London, I would say. And then at the end of 2023, it went out to all of London within the M25. And it really has accelerated the modernisation of the fleet, the vehicle fleet in London, and of course, more modern vehicles are cleaner, at least if they have a combustion engine, they've got better filtration of the particulates.
Yeah, and I think as a fairly infrequent visitor to London, you can actually tell. There's been an actual physical difference.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about it. As a kid that's been coming into London since his teenage years, there's used to come back home with black soot, black bogies,
blow your nose.
Yeah, black bogies. As a result of coming into London, it was just the thing. No, that's really powerful. Did that expansion of the ULEZ zone happened over a period of time? Did during that period of time when you were monitoring that process, because I know you were heavily involved in that, did you see the problem being shifted out? So when the ULEZ zone initially happened in central London, did that just shift the problem out or exacerbate the problem out? Because that was always the trope, I think, that was kind of put out there, was that you're just moving a problem from one area to another, right? Did you see that in the data at all, that you saw an increase in pollution on the peripheries of the low emission zones?
No, definitely not. It started in that central area because that had the highest pollution, and it also had the highest bus and taxi use, and the GLA obviously have more control over those fleets, so they were able to modernize those at the same time as telling people you have to have this type of vehicle if you're going to come into that central area. So because it had the highest pollution, they started there, and they were able to demonstrate benefit, within, I think it was the first year's report showed substantial drops in nitrogen dioxide concentrations. That gave them the confidence then to move out to the North and South Circular areas. But we didn't then see, the pollution moving further out. That pollution was always there, and it didn't get worse as a consequence. But it did get better where the ULEZ was introduced.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because that's the kind of I think the logical assumption is that you're effectively just everybody's now just orbiting the low emission zone, and that now in cars some way you just are kind of moving like a ring around Venus, out and out and out, but that's not actually what's happening. You're just effectively just removing pollution sources where you introduce a low emission zone.
People kept to their normal routines, and if they had to come in, then they either took public transport or they had a vehicle which was compatible.
Yeah. And, you see that in the data. I remember hearing a presentation last year, and they were saying that in central London now, the primary source of particulate matter is commercial kitchens.
Yeah.
So there's a new problem to think about, perhaps, but and we'll come on to that actually, because we want to talk about the battle in the lungs. But it just goes to show that this is impactful. That effectively, it's been able to reduce particulate matter from traffic sources now to below one of the problems that was below it.
Yeah.
So it works.
And it was also, the fact that the traffic pollution, that fresh diesel emission, was the most problematic from a toxicity point of view.
Yeah.
So not only did we reduce the pollution, we reduced one of the more toxic forms of pollution.
Yeah. Well, let's get on to toxicity, because one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that you've been involved in something called the oxidative potential of PM and pollution for a long time. Firstly, what do we mean by that? Because this is a new term to a lot of people, I think. I think people understand particles and sizes and their potentially to get into the body. I think people can naturally associate that it probably is not good to be absorbing heavy metals or something, or viruses or something into your body that's going to have a negative impact. What's oxidative potential, and why does that matter to the body?
So it's a chemical term. And if you just, we start at the basics. If we think of a molecule, we know that it's got a nucleus. We know which is made up of protons and neutrons. They're not the important thing from an oxidative point of view. The important thing is the electrons, which are on the outside of the molecule. And electrons are most comfortable when they come in pairs. But if a molecule has got an unpaired electron, then basically from a chemistry point of view, it's very reactive because it wants to grab an electron from something else so it is stable again. And so a free radical is a molecule with an unpaired electron. And if we breathe in something that's got unpaired electrons, then it will cause oxidative damage because it's got oxidative potential.
That's interesting. Now, for listeners, if you're interested in radicals and free radicals, go back and have a listen to John Wenger's podcast with me that he did. That they've been focusing on free radicals in the environment in general, and it was quite fascinating listening to him, quite how much of an engine room radicals are in the environment for almost all of the air chemistry that's going on outside. Incredibly difficult to measure, incredibly transient species because they're so reactive. They're reacting almost instantly, but they're a real engine room for a lot of the pollution that we have outside. And I think people also understand ozone being a good example of something with a high oxidative potential. It's quite radical, and it has a big impact on chemistry as well, both inside and outside. So there's this chemistry going on where the things can be reactive. And that's what we're talking about, is it ultimately, these reactive components to the air. What's the oxidative potential's relationship to particulate matter then?
Okay. Particulates do have oxidative potential. You can demonstrate that quite easily, the same way as you can with ozone or nitrogen dioxide, which is a free radical itself. And when you then start looking at the composition of the particle, you can then see which entities are driving that oxidative potential. And it tends to be metals. So copper, zinc, transition metals like that have free radicals, unpaired electrons. So the particle, think about the particle as being the carrier, and it's carrying transition metals, which will be looking to grab radicals, so looking to grab electrons. And when they come into your lung, they're going to be grabbing those electrons from your lung cells. And that's what causes damage to your lung cells.
Okay, so the particles that we're breathing, rather than having a toxicological impact, that it's got a chemical in it that's going to cause damage, that what you're talking about here is it reacting with cell tissue or fluids in the lung and actually changing them when they come into contact. Because that's the thing about radicals, they want to combine with something, and when you combine two things, it changes.
It changes the other thing.
And the other thing, exactly. And that's the harm of that process, is that it's a naughty species. It likes changing things to other things, and that may not be that good. So what's happening in the lung then? That these radicals are hitting. What is it about the lungs? Is it the fluids, the tissues? What is it reacting with in the lungs?
When we were able to actually look at the lung structure in a way which preserved all the fluid components that are in there, and this is back in the sort of late 70s using electron microscopy, we find that there is this layer of fluid from your nose right down to your deepest alveoli. That's the air sac at the bottom of the conducting airways. And this layer of fluid, we call it the respiratory tract lining fluid, RTLF. When we were able to then get samples of that, which you can do through a process called bronchoscopy, taking those samples to the laboratory and analyzing them, we actually find that it has a very interesting composition. It's not just plasma, it's not just water, it's a special fluid which has a number of small molecules in it, which we call antioxidants. And some of those antioxidants you make based on your genetic profile. So one of them is called glutathione, and it's a very, very powerful antioxidant. It's just made up of 3 amino acids, so it's very simple, but it's very powerful. Some of the other antioxidants, like vitamin C and vitamin E, which most people will have heard of, you can't make, but they're there in normal people, healthy people, they're there in quite large concentrations. And where are they coming from? They're coming from your diet. And so these antioxidants, when a particle comes in and hits that layer of fluid on the surface of the lung, what we have is what I call surface wars going on. So you've got the free radicals wanting electrons. You've got the antioxidants wanting to kill the free radicals. So they donate electrons freely to the radicals, and they will, in doing so, they will nullify that radical. Going now back to my seesaw, if you have got lots of antioxidants over here and you breathe in some pollution, then not a lot will happen, except what I've just talked about. But if you have got less antioxidants or you get more pollution coming in, then you'll run out of defenses. You'll run out of antioxidant defense. And that's then when the pollutant particle will actually start taking electrons from the cells of the lung. And then that sets up a whole series of events which leads to inflammation, white blood cells coming and trying to kill the radicals. But your immune system is set up to kill what? Bacteria and viruses, biological live entities. What they're facing with here is a diesel particle. It's not alive. It's just a series of chemicals. So it can't, your immune cells can't do anything to kill it.
Can't mimic its signature. It's just not. Is that ultimately what then leads to things like chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, non-communicable respiratory illnesses, where over time your exposure to these pollutants, if you're not able to protect yourself against them, your lungs lose the battle, and then you get those chronic inflammations, all the illnesses and diseases that we're talking about. When
this has happened day in, day out for months, years, yes, eventually your lung will be scarred, your immune system will be compromised, and that's when you develop a disease such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can imagine that happens at all sorts of different levels, at silicosis level, it's eventually that you just can't hit that balance. So there's an interesting thing happening from a body's perspective then, that there's there's both a kind of a nurture and nature thing going on. You were saying that the natural DNA of a person will produce these, I can't remember the name of the term now, but the really powerful one. Glutathione.
Yeah.
Do some people produce more than others? Is this like most genetics, that
Absolutely.
some people are just stronger in that sense than others? Some people are more vulnerable?
Yeah. So, we know that there's a whole variable scale of ability to deal with pollutant challenges. Some people are at this end and they're more vulnerable. Other people are at this end and they're less vulnerable. And, you've got a scale of 1, just think of a scale of 1 to 10. And the people where someone falls on that scale will depend partly on their mum and dad, what they've been given as their DNA profile, and partly on their diet, and I guess thirdly on their environment, what they're being challenged with.
Yeah, and this is where you kind of also get into the kind of social justice end of it as well. You'll get certain communities will be predisposed, a really hard word to say, to, for example, not being able to absorb vitamin C like everybody else. So they may be able to actually, even before the genetics, may not be able to protect themselves through diet. You get, vulnerable communities, fuel poor people that may not be having a good diet.
Absolutely.
And protecting themselves in the right way. And then those people are often funneled into areas where the pollution is the highest.
Absolutely.
And the environment's the worst. So you kind of get that triple jeopardy, don't you, of scenarios where the people that are least able to protect themselves genetically and through general health are then funneled into urban areas where they're exposed. So the seesaws, it's a losing battle from a seesaw perspective. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the reasons that we hear, every 6 months about, we should be doing more about free school dinners, getting kids off to a great start in the morning, making sure they're having a good breakfast, etc. That's all part of that equation of the dealing with what we have to deal with from an environmental challenge point of view.
Yeah. Is it testable, that, like at a medical level, to know if somebody has run out of reserves in that seesaw from a lung protection perspective without doing bronchoscopies? Because I can't imagine you're bringing every kid in to do a bronchoscopy to measure the lung lining. Is that your only route, really? Like, is there a way of predicting at what point, like blood test from a cholesterol or whatever it is? I had a high hemoglobin count the other day and did a second one and it was grand. But there are these kind of metrics where you go, oh, hang on a minute, you might want to be careful here. Is there a test for this where you can actually go, okay, this is a problem for me now as an individual?
When we wanted to work with children as opposed to adults where we were doing bronchoscopies, we came up with an alternative approach, which is called induced sputum. So what you can do is you can get the child to inhale it's basically a salt solution, and that will make them cough, and basically it brings up some of the airway fluid. And you can take that airway fluid and you can look what's in it and what's happening in it. Yeah. And interestingly, what we found was that in children who had been exposed to a certain amount of pollution on their trip to school, and we did the induced sputum, in the morning at school, we were seeing some of the immune cells, these white blood cells which protect you, which go round your circulation. But when people are exposed to pollution, they end up coming out onto the lung surface to try and kill that diesel particle. We were seeing those same neutrophils in the children's induced sputum as we were seeing in the adults when we exposed them to diesel. So
it just goes to show how important childhood is, doesn't it? Because you were saying, and I had Abigail Whitehouse on, and she was really she painted this picture of a glass ceiling you can create for children. There's a kind of a lung function limit, and once you hit that, that's it. And this is why it's so important, like you were saying, school dinners, decent diet, reducing exposure to pollution. This stuff really matters in those formative years because
Absolutely.
that's where the damage is done and those glass ceilings are set, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a moment. I just wanted to very briefly tell you about Farmwood. Farmwood is one of the most successful SME ventilation companies in the UK. Multi-award winning for their work in ventilation, compliance and health and safety. Farmwood has spent 23 years becoming the go-to service partner for a range of UK and EU ventilation manufacturers. They work on commercial, industrial and residential projects, and they're all about linking up academics, industry and engineers, driving real regulation reform and, most importantly, making sure the buildings we live and work in are healthier and safer for everyone. Their managing director, Nathan Wood, is a fellow campaigner of mine and someone I respect deeply. He is the chairman of World Ventilate Day and was previously the indoor air quality chairman at BESA. He's now leading the charge for competence and compliance across the ventilation sector in the UK. Farmwood are also really big advocates for apprenticeships, helping to develop the next generation of HVAC engineers who are going to keep our buildings breathing. They're a company that genuinely cares about buildings and people. You'll find more details in the show notes and at farmwood.co.uk. Now, back to the podcast.
Once that you've kind of depleted that barrier in the lungs, does it also make it more possible for the oxidative potential of those products to make it into the system of the body as well? Because, you know, we hear that particularly particulate matter now is a multi-systemic disease, that, you know, this is causing liver disease and cardiovascular issues and early onset dementia, and like that once pollution is moving through the membranes of the lung into the bloodstream, it's then being carried round and, you know, transversing across every organ of the body. So is the same thing happening at a vascular level, that these things are making it through? And is that a function of a lack of protection, or is that just happening as well at the same time? Like are the two things associated in some way, do you think? Or is the oxidative potential of particulate matter also directly impacting organs in the same way as it's impacting the lungs?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. And I think if we go back to the initial part, which is what's happening in the lung lining fluid, the concept there is that you've got X amount of pollution and you've got X amount of defense. And so therefore, if that defense is insufficient to deal with all the pollution, then some of it will get across into the systemic circulation, move around the body, and whenever it lodges, if it's a particle, when it lodges in the liver or the brain, then it's still got free radical activity. So it will then directly damage, the tissue wherever it's ended up. So, and there's evidence of that, certainly from animal challenge studies. You can see that there are particles that do end up in different organs. You can see damage to those organs. And ultimately, I think it comes back to the balance between the challenge of the pollutant, which is not just happening, in one shot. It could be happening for, hours on end, depending on where the individual is, and the defenses that they have to deal with that. But ultimately, this multi-organ damage occurring from pollution exposure, it starts with free radical attack.
As interesting as all this is, what's the fix, in the sense that when you look at the pollution and the particles that are most harmful, I get the sense, talking to you, it really is traffic related, industrial related, pollution, burning, combustion, those kind of things. That seems to be where the hot spot is. There's something about that process, is there, that it's just creating the metals and the chemistry that is just harmful. It's just not good burning shit. And and basically, like,
I don't think it's ultimately creating the toxicity. If you imagine, if you take fuels, those are extracted and then they're cracked and refined, but all of that material was in the original extraction. So those metals, are present in the earth and they're part of the oil that's extracted. So, and those transition metals, as I said, have got unpaired electrons. So they will drive free radical reactions, but they've always been a part of that combustion product.
Whereas some of the other particles that we're exposed to, like sea salt or earth, dust, sand, storms, even to some degree wildfires, although I know particularly with when it hits urban areas, like the toxicity levels just go through the roof for obvious reasons. Some of those other sources aren't necessarily generating some of that risk, but there's something about the fossil fuels, the oils, the gases, the petroleums, the plastics, that stuff, it just by its nature, it is just not good to be breathing in.
Correct, yeah. And will cause damage at a much lower dose.
Yeah.
I mean, desert dust is still hazardous, but it's hazardous, at sort of 10, 20-fold higher concentrations than these tailpipe emissions.
Yeah. And what about the kind of industrial emissions? Is it the same kind of thing going on there where you've got, heavy industry? Are they producing the same kind of toxicity, do you think?
I think originally a lot of them were, but of course there's many different types of industry. But I think that was sort of cottoned on a lot earlier than the traffic issue. And a lot of the heavy industry you'll find was, it's moved outside urban areas and usually has very high stacks for the emissions. There was regulation to put in good filtration on those chimneys, and you get a lot more dilution as a consequence. But still, I'm sure there were still many of them would have had high toxicity at the source point, but probably because of the high stack and the filters that were introduced, that would have reduced that risk somewhat. But that's very different from an urban area, which we have taken as the new world, as it were, where we brought everybody together, we brought all the services together, and everybody needed a car or two cars in their family. And we suddenly had this problem, which was not as easy as dealing with as taking, this factory and moving it over here.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it, about heavy industry? It's one big massive point source that you can regulate for and control, but effectively road traffic is heavy industry just distributed, isn't it? Ultimately, that's the challenge.
Which no one wants to give up.
Nobody wants to give up, no. Yeah, and that's the challenge. When we move into our indoor environment, do those sources change? And are you seeing areas of risk there in the same way you've seen with traffic? So, because we talk about particulate matter now indoors as well quite regularly, and sometimes it's just to reflect how effective the systems are at protecting us from outdoors, as an example. But particularly in residential settings, in commercial settings, particulate matter is there. We see it. Does it represent the same risk? What's your kind of view on what you're seeing in the indoor environment? If we from a source perspective, because we still get traffic pollution in, of course.
Yeah.
But what are you seeing from an indoor perspective with PMs?
So to start that, I have to remind you that we've been concentrating on outdoor ambient pollution for 33 years. Yeah. We've got very good understanding of many aspects of it. We're getting on top of it now. With indoor pollution, it's pretty rudimentary, our understanding. We can make the measurements. We can look at the concentrations. We can look at the types of pollution and particles again and identify the sources. But linking them to, health effects, that's still quite a journey. So, as you said, yes, depending on the fabric of the building, we may be getting some outdoor pollution coming in, but generally that is not a major problem. Most, in our experience, in what we call the Well Home Study, which is here in West London, where we had over 100 homes instrumented, the majority of the pollution was indoor generated. And that generation was dependent on the behaviour of the householders. And dependent also on the nature of the residency. So what we found was a lot more biological pollution, particulate pollution, than we would experience outdoors. And that mold was due to damp conditions in the home. And I'm not talking about, rain coming in. I'm talking about, increased humidity. And that was because these individuals maybe didn't have the ability to dry their clothes outside and they were drying them inside, or they were taking a shower and didn't have the ability to open the window because outside the bathroom window was a busy road or traffic, which they didn't want the pollution coming in. So there was a lot of damp and mold issues, which really surprised us, the extent of it. Then for the indoor sources, gas cooking is the big one we talk about. Wood burning is the other one. But a lot of these more modern wood burners, the eco wood burners as they talk about them, they still emit a little bit of pollution into the area where they're located. But most of it goes up the chimney and goes out into the neighbour's garden. And again, depending on wind directions, etc., that could be having a big consequence on neighbours' exposure. And then there are other simple things, pets, cleaning regimes. If you walk down a supermarket, aisle where the cleaning agents are, there's hundreds of them. And a lot of them actually are quite complex in their nature and totally dependent now than what we did a generation ago, where we made up some vinegar and water, just to clean our surfaces.
Just basic soap.
Yeah.
I think that's what's fascinating for me about the indoor environment is that, I think a large part of this conversation this morning has been blowing open how complex this is, even when we just start looking at outdoors. And I'm not saying that outdoors is simple, clearly it's not from the conversation we've been having, but the complexities of what we actually mean by PM, the speciation, the different chemicals, the oxidative potential, the physics that's going on, the chemistry that's going on, it's unbelievably complex. And that's out there, right, with point sources of traffic and what have you. You move that indoors. And, we look out this window here, and when we talk about ambient air pollution, we kind of look at on our horizon, it's a kind of a single entity. I mean, there'll be street impacts depending on weather and so on, but it's kind of all of that. But I'm looking out behind you, Frank, and there are, 10, 20,000 buildings out behind you. Each one of those has got a dozen spaces in them, different sizes, different airflows, different activities, different materials, different chemicals being used. It's mind-bendingly complex. And even and just the chemistry that's going on, the reaction of ozone to skin oils to, as you said, limonene. Limonene comes into contact with ozone. It produces formaldehyde and PM. Yep. Right? This is just one mad chemical reaction going on in these spaces. So there's a lot going on. As you say, we're only just starting on that journey, really, in trying to figure out and then draw the lines to the potential health impacts.
And one other one, which I hadn't appreciated until we started this study, was the chemistry between the chemicals and the biologicals.
Yeah.
Wow, you can imagine what might be going on there.
Yeah.
And, you may be ending up with some of the biologicals being neutralized, but you may actually have some of them which are activated more.
Yeah.
But going back to that, the pollen story with the thunderstorms, you may end up with something which is,
But also what you get indoors, which you may not necessarily get outdoors so much, is, you're not getting stuff neutralized by things like UV in the same way that you do outdoors. You get a lot of resuspension and settling going on. And, as Karim Mandine was saying, we kind of forget that stuff will sit on a surface for a while, absorb fire retardants or whatever it's sitting on, and then find itself resuspended and broken down. And, so like there's a story to what you're breathing in an indoor space in perhaps a different way than we have outdoors. There's a lot going on. What's the future for that from a medical perspective and a research perspective, do you think? I mean, you mentioned you were doing the well study. Yeah. There's a lot of research going on at the moment, isn't there, across the board in trying to understand sources of pollution indoors and the impacts on health.
We're basically repeating what we've done outside.
Yeah.
We're repeating that inside, identifying the sources, identifying their relative toxicity and likely health effects. But we're doing this inside a private place. So that's been the real challenge. You're going inside someone's home and you're examining how they're living their lives in there. And that's, you have to be very, very careful. And you have to ensure that you don't antagonize the people that you're working with.
Yeah, and change behavior in the process as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you have some information, it's how you then provide that information in a coherent, understandable way. So it's a whole series of new challenges walking inside someone's home.
There's a lot of assumptions being made at the moment on the health impacts of exposure to PM indoors, which is largely relying on the epidemiological evidence of outdoors. Are they fair assumptions to be making, do you think? That is there natural crossover? Can we assume the same health impacts apply? Or do you think there's a risk in translating the big body of evidence that we've got from exposure to outdoor PM naturally to our exposure indoors?
I think given our knowledge base of pollution in general and health effects, that we should be wary of what we're doing in our homes and what we're being exposed to and our children are being exposed to. However, I think at this point in time, we don't have enough information to suggest behavioral change or regulation, which would really impact a way of life. But what we can do is we can talk about the benefits of ventilation, which is pretty obvious, but not well understood. And we can talk about the major sources of pollution, the obvious ones, gas cooking. And if there is mold in the home, then not just making sure that that's eradicated, but making sure the residents understand why it was there in the first place. So I see education as being a big component of this indoor work, whereas I didn't see that when we were working in the ambient field. I wasn't saying, to people, don't drive to work today because you're going to be exposed to a lot of pollution on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the impacts you've been able to have in with ambient air have been policy driven, right? And that's much harder to do in a home environment. We can encourage the electrification of the built environment, which is happening. So we see less combustion products in the home as a result, which will reduce people's exposures to not just particulate matter, but also nitrogen dioxide and other things associated with combustion. But we're not going to legislate for making people stop cooking indoors, right? So that there's only so far you can go with the built environment. I think what's interesting about homes and buildings is that there's still only so many levers you can pull in a home to affect an outcome. You mentioned one, ventilation, but it kind of comes down to the hierarchies of control. At the end of the day, it's about eliminating sources where you can and substituting them for less risky sources. So replacing gas cookers with electric cookers and things like that, right? Using less toxic cleaning chemicals and low VOC emitting paints and things that are going to create less chemistry in the space. They're all real basic fundamentals of risk control. And then you've got ventilation. So even if we've over-egged the risk of PM because we've associated something that we've got good understanding with outside to the indoor environment, at the end of the day, the fix is still the same, and that's adequate ventilation. And if you have that, then you're likely to deal with those sources at source. I mean, my big concern with the indoor environment is that, we know cooking is a big source of particulate matter generation in the home, whether that's the gases or the vaporization of the oils and various other things when you heat stuff. So a cooker hood is a fundamental tool in our armament of removing pollutants at source before they spread, yet it's the cheapest piece of crap that we often put into a home, or very rarely even connected.
So can you tell me, given that, why extractor fans don't automatically get switched on when the cooker or the hob gets switched on?
Yeah.
Why is there not a connection?
Yeah, I don't know. And there are cookers that do it.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge has been to do it effectively. And there's a lot of research happening in the States at the moment, actually, on cooker hood capture efficiency, the type of flow rates that are required. The reality for point source extraction for cooking is that it needs to be pretty high and pretty effective to be effective. Mm-hmm. And so you're talking typically, I think, to get really good impact, 60 litres a second. Now, most cooker hoods will struggle to do 10 or 15 litres a second when you go out and measure. And when they do that, we all know what they sound like, because we've never valued it as a piece of equipment. It's the cheapest fan that you can manufacture, put in a big rattly metal box that, if you're lucky, was exhausted to outside, and even then probably through poor ducting and flappy grills. So we've made them really bad products, and the reality is a developer won't be able to sell his house for any more for spending 800 euros or 500 quid on a cooker hood. So that I think, that's a shame. I think I think at some point, and it will happen, I know the regulator in the UK is looking at it. I know they're looking at it seriously in ASHRAE and trying to develop some standards in the States for it. Cooker hoods, I would predict, being the next big regulatory shift, because there are engineering solutions out for it. It's not complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. And I think the more we understand about cooking as a point source of pollution in the home, the more important that will become.
And I think clearly it hasn't been associated previously. And that's why we have these inferior products.
Yeah.
Probably put in originally to maybe just get rid of some smells or something.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things the advocates would say of the kind of the harm work that's being done on indoor pollutants, because so to give listeners a kind of an idea, that they've looked at all of the pollutants that were indoors, the volumes of them. They've then looked at the harm impact, the epidemiological and toxicological impact, even though a lot of that from a PM perspective is related to ambient air. Yeah. But it represents in that outcome about 75% of all the harm in the home is particulate matter. So they would say, well, even if we're wrong, the chances are it's not going to make you're not going to make a massive difference, because at the moment it's 75%. What if we're half wrong? What if we're 50% over-egged it? It's still, we're going to represent, 30-35% of the risk.
Yeah.
So so we still need to vent it. So the solution is the same, regardless of whether the evidence actually in the end says, well, maybe it's not quite as harmful.
Yeah.
My suspicion, my gut is that with all the air chemistry and all of the stuff that's happening within a home, I can imagine it being as harmful, even though it may not have some of the industrial, the tailpipe emission risk associated with it. There's so much else going on in that space that you don't have from ambient air pollution that I can't imagine it doesn't. The polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the chemicals, the reactions that are going on. Maybe it's not even the oxidative potential and the heavy metal stuff, but there's maybe other impacts that we're thinking about.
That's what we believe at this point. Yeah. Interesting observation that came out of the Wellhome study was where we had, I think it was 65% of the homes had an asthmatic child. That's what we recruited on, really. And we put sensors into the kitchen, into the living area, which was often connected to the kitchen in these modern homes, just an open area, and one in the child's bedroom. And what we found was that clearly there was peaks of particles and gases during the cooking times, and the pollution would move from the kitchen into the living area quite quickly. And then if it was a 2-story house, it would go up into the second floor where the child's bedroom was, which the door would generally be open. The pollution would then go into that room. And then if this was the evening, then the child would be put to bed, the door would be closed, and in fact, the pollution had fallen back to control levels in the kitchen and the living area by midnight, and yet it was still high for most of the night in the child's bedroom because it was a sealed unit.
Yeah, interesting that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us about the Wellhome study, because that was fascinating. That, from what I understand of that was there was quite an element of citizen science in that, or certainly engagement with the people that were doing the study. Maybe explain for listeners a little bit about what the Wellhome study was, and is it something that's still going on? This was just the first results out of it.
So it was our first attempt to understand the indoor environment, and clearly it's very, very variable. So we managed to recruit 100 homes which accepted our instrumentation to go in. But the way in which we did this was we first of all identified what we call community ambassadors, because as scientists, going and knocking on someone's door and explaining to them, the busy people, it just would not have worked. So we appointed 10 ambassadors who were either maybe the local minister, or maybe the person that ran the local food bank, or just generally someone who was seen as being a leader in that community. And through that approach, we got a whole range of different communities, ethnic communities and social challenged communities as well, economically challenged.
So was it a fairly representative sample of general urban London, or was it concentrated in kind of fuel poor and social housing? It was quite a broad. It
was. We had all aspects. So it was a good representation, I would say, of West London.
Okay.
Not of all of London, and not certainly of all of the UK, but certain aspects of it would be. And as I say, we instrumented their home for 1 month in the autumn, winter, and 1 month in the spring, summer. So different, environmental temperature conditions. And we got them to fill in diaries of their activities. in the home, their behaviours in the home. And our instruments were sitting, clicking away, getting all the information on the pollutants that they were generating and basically breathing. And we just finished the study at the end of December, and we're now working our way through, there's hundreds of thousands of data points. But we came up with some general observations, which I've already mentioned. Damp and mold in social housing the level of it was a real surprise, and very worrying actually. And gas cooking was an obvious source of a lot of pollution at meal times. And when the pollution was moving about through the home also was of interest. And generally, in the vast majority of the homes, it was the indoor generated pollution which dominated. Outdoor ingresses were relatively few and far between, and only happened, if a window was open. So the fabric of the building seemed to be generally good.
There was a certain amount of, not psychology, but you were looking at behaviours as well in this study, weren't you? And I think self-efficacy was really important, people's belief that they could have an impact on their space. So were you looking at changes in behaviour over the time? No.
We stressed that we didn't want them to change their behaviour, because this was a study which would give us a baseline understanding of how behaviours were linked to. This
was your baseline,
exposures.
Basically.
Exactly.
Yeah. So could they see the air quality results?
So we specifically used sensors which didn't have any digital out readings, so they didn't know the results until afterwards. But afterwards, we sat down with every family and we explained to them what we were seeing, how that was related to behaviour as far as we understood it, and what the consequences might be. And some of the pollution levels were astronomical, during cooking times. You're talking about over 1,000 micrograms per meter cube. So that's the baseline. That was Well Home 1. We're now just about to start Well Home 2, which will be a behavioural change based study.
And the same cohort of families?
Yes, in some cases, but in other cases, what we're doing is we're piggybacking onto a number of retrofit programs, which are happening in different councils across London, in fact, across the country. And I'm sure you're aware of, some of the very negative impacts of some of these programs regarding, increased sealing of the homes to reduce energy use, but as a consequence, decreasing ventilation. So we're piggybacking on some of those, but we will also go in and do some exchanges ourselves where we will take the gas supply out and put in an induction hob and look at the benefits of that.
Are you doing any assessments of the ventilation system as part of Well Home? So are you doing any kind of ventilation pathology work to understand what they have and if it's working, to understand the data results that you're seeing? 'Cause I always find that fascinating in air quality studies, particularly in home, across the board really, to be honest, we undertake these kind of air quality studies in spaces but we never really know if what they had in the home was working effectively, because it's not as easy to figure out as people think sometimes. Is that something you've looked at, kind of to understand, do they have fans in the bathroom? Does it actually work when it comes on? Maybe not on the baseline study, the first one, but it'd be interesting, like going forward, to actually understand, they've got a bathroom fan and they use it, but actually it's only moving 3 litres a second or something.
Not in detail. Yeah. So in their questionnaires or visits, we would log what they have in respect of those entities. And then they would be questioned as to whether they used them or not.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing as window opening and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But actually testing them, no. Ourselves.
Yeah, it's a fascinating element of air quality research, I think, is often we'll take quite detailed records of the size of a home, where it's located. We'll measure outdoor air. We'll look at how many people live there. We'll fill in questionnaires. And then one of the major engineering controls we have in that space for managing the build-up of pollution over time is ventilation. And it's rare as hen's teeth to see any detail on the actual performance of the ventilation system, which could be one of the major contributors to what people are seeing. But it's very hard if you're not, as an academic, I think it's relatively easy to go in and deliver questionnaires or even to ask them. It's relatively straightforward to deploy sensors and look at data. It takes an awful lot of practical experience to assess a ventilation system. And I think that's where the research community often comes unstuck. I was only having a conversation with the researcher in Ireland there a couple of weeks ago, and they were presenting, there were 4 or 5 ventilation systems. They just didn't even know what they were. And they were going, can you tell us what they were? And they were all the same system, actually. It's just they were from different manufacturers and they just looked different. Right. But they just didn't have the experience to be able to assess even what, at a basic level, they were looking at, which I think is a huge gap. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's the same way whenever, when we started working in the ambient environment, we needed people who could set up monitoring stations, and we needed data scientists. Yeah. And then we needed toxicologists, and then we needed epidemiologists. As we move into the indoor environment, we're going to need some of those, but we're also going to need some extra specialties as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. I can tell you that some of the people, especially in the social housing, where there were extractor fans in the cooking area, but the filters in them were never changed.
No.
Never changed.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? How did you end up here? We're in Imperial College today, so if you're watching on video, there's a great sign behind us on the top of one of the buildings. What's your work here? What's your role in Imperial? Do you do much teaching?
Yeah, so I lead the environmental research group, which does everything around air quality in London, and also now increasingly around water quality as well. So that's obviously a new challenge area for us, especially at the moment. And the environmental research group has got 8 teams. It's got a measurement team which runs the London Air Quality Network and the London Sensor Community Network now. It's got an aerosol science team which runs those 2 super sites I mentioned earlier and does lots of work on the underground system and trains, just in construction sites. Then we've got our modelling team, because with air pollution, you can't monitor everywhere, so you've got to model in between. And we've got a very good modelling team which has been going really from day one. And they have a model called CMAC Urban, which is one of the most advanced ones used in urban areas. And it has got a 20 by 20 metre resolution for London, for all of London. So starting with that, this is 10, 15 years ago, we were then able to work with the Greater London Authority, the Mayor's Office, because that model allows us to, if we think diesel traffic is the problem, that model allows us to take all the diesel buses out of the model, and that will show you what the improvement of air quality will be. Or if you stop all the diesel cars coming into central London, as we did for the ULEZ, you can do that on the back of an envelope, well, a big supercomputer, to begin with. So that was instrumental, that work was instrumental in the introduction of the congestion charging scheme, the low emission zone, now the ultra low emission zones. But the other benefit of it, and that takes us on to the other teams, the other benefit of it is it tells me what the pollution is outside your door, wherever you live in London. So we were able to take that data along with health cohort data, population data, hospital records, doctors' records, and bring the 2 together. And that's what gave us the understanding that yes, this level of pollution and the nature of that pollution in London is associated with these health effects. be it whatever disease that we looked at. And that again was really instrumental in getting, the mayors noticed that they needed to do something about traffic. Next, we move on to our exposure science team, because instead of doing this modeling where people lived and what they've been exposed to, we really wanted to understand what you and I are exposed to as we sit here or as we walk, to work or walk home or wherever we are. So we worked with Dyson, who produced a backpack with sensors in it for particles and gases. And we took these backpacks and we gave them to school children. And so we did a number of studies with school children, understanding exactly what they were breathing throughout the day, wherever they were.
Follow the patient.
And this happened because technology had moved forward, sensors were miniaturized, etc. But that was fantastic because it allowed us to see. We thought we were going to see the peaks as the kids were, going to school in the morning and going home in the evening, whatever, if they were driving or walking along busy roads. Where did we see most pollution?
In the home.
In the home.
Yeah.
That was a real eye-opener. And that really was one of the things that started to get us interested in indoor pollution. But before we go there, the next team that we have is our epidemiology team, which are the ones that linked the modelling data with the population health data. Our toxicology team was taking filters from Marylebone Road, filters from Honor Oak Park, filters from here, filters from there, and comparing the oxidative potential of the particles on those filters on an equal mass basis. And that's what, again, pointed to busy, fresh road traffic as being, a part of the problem. And then I think it's finally started, no, two more.
Yeah, you said 8. That's a great memory. You've managed to get through them without forgetting one.
About 5 years ago, we started our newest team, which is our microplastics team. And the reason we did that was because as we sort of had helped to bring in things like the ultra low emission zone and traffic pollution, tailpipe traffic pollution was going down and down and down. And I said 2030, it'll all be gone. What else do we have to worry about? Non-tailpipe emissions from vehicles. It's a common term these days, but it wasn't, a decade ago. So started looking at that. Obviously brake-wear, a lot of metals. But the big one that came out for me was tire wear. A, because there's so much of it, but B, I was astounded whenever I found out that a modern tire is like 55% plastic. So we have now a fossil fuel industry which is losing its market share on surface transport because of electrification. Where is their other major outlet for their product? It's plastic. So I foresee more and more of oil and gas going towards plastic production going forward. And yet we know that it's really, really difficult to break down these plastic products. They're going to landfill. We developed a methodology to be able to characterize a plastic particle, and there's lots of different types, depending on what the polymer is and the chemical signatures of it. But we did that for London air, we did it for London water, and we did it for lots of food types. And plastic is everywhere.
Is plastic classed as a pop? Is it? We were only talking about yesterday about kind of forever chemicals and things like that. It's a persistent chemical in the environment. Very, like you say, very difficult to break down. But I was talking to a researcher in India not so long ago, and they were talking about the concern of inhaled particles of plastic as well. I'm guessing that's something that you're starting to look at. That these are persistent pollutants. They're very difficult to break down, so they're going to break down and break down and break down. So they're then going to be suspended ultimately as plastic particles. Yeah. Are you starting? You can see them, I guess, in your
So we now have instrumentation which will pick up plastic particles of the size that we worry about that gets into our lungs. And no, they're not regulated. Some of the chemicals, the forever chemicals on plastics, and there's a lot of them, they're regulated, of course, but the plastic itself is not. They're all around us, and increasingly there are studies starting to come out which say they are related to health. Now, there's a lot of problems that we have identified as we develop the methodologies to identify these different plastic particles. And a lot of there's complex instrumentation. It's pyrolysis, GC-MS, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. And you combust the particle and then you get the signature from it. Tells you what the polymer is, tells you what the chemicals are as well. But a lot of those signals we have found are similar to what you get when you actually just take some human tissue and burn it as well, the fats, the lipids. So we are very cautious at the moment, and we think that there's a lot of misinformation being developed by unfortunate groups that don't have that expertise, but they maybe have the toxicological, or maybe they're clinicians.
Yeah.
So it's a real interesting time for this question.
Is there a bit of correlation, causation confusion going on? Is that a kind of what you see happening?
Well, it may not even be plastic. I mean, there was a paper come out in Nature a month ago now, which basically was reporting plastic in the brain. And when you calculated how much they were reporting per weight of tissue, it was a credit card. So they were saying these brains had a credit card of plastic, which is, totally ridiculous. So we have a microplastics team. We are worried that we're going to have more plastic in society. We don't know how harmful it is, and it may not be the plastic itself, it may be the chemicals, because every plastic component's got an array of chemicals in it, and they might just be carrying those chemicals into our bodies. But that's one of our next big focus areas. And then the final team is our emerging chemical contaminants team, and their focus is primarily on water and all the problems we have now with our water systems, because pharmaceutical residues, explosives, signatures, these chemicals I've just been talking about, agricultural runoff, it's all in the water, and we're getting a lot of these after, these overflows after the surges from the waste treatment plants. You've got to quantify what's there, you've got to understand its toxicity, and you've got to decide whether it's having direct health effects, because that all then drives policy going forward. But it does seem to be very problematic.
Yeah, water, maybe there's a Water Quality Matters podcast that's needed or something at some point.
At the moment, this week in fact, there is a new documentary called Dirty Business. And if you have time, I recommend you look at that.
Yeah. Are you involved in that, were you? At some
No. Innocent bystander.
Yeah. So that's quite a big group quite a centre of research here for...
It's over 100 of us.
Yeah.
30 of those are PhD students.
Wow.
70 staff.
Yeah.
But we've been going for 33 years, so it hasn't happened overnight.
How long have you been here now at Imperial?
We moved from King's College London to Imperial in 2020.
Yeah.
And we did because of this.
Yeah.
We are sitting here on the 10th floor of the Urine building at White City, and we're sitting in a meeting room at the moment, but on the other side of these doors, there's fantastic laboratories. There are clean rooms where we do our plastic work, because plastic's everywhere. And we've just got great facilities here. Do
you do the environmental chamber work here as well? Have you got those kind of spaces?
No, we haven't. The environmental chamber work, our human work, is done in northern Sweden at the University of Umeå.
Okay.
And we started that 20 years ago, and that was a real game changer, because you can do work with cells, you can do work even in animals, but ultimately you got to translate into humans. And when we were able to work with clinical colleagues in Umeo, where we would put human volunteers into a chamber and flooded it with an atmosphere which you would get when you're walking up and down Oxford Street, and then able to actually look inside their lungs with bronchoscopy and do various, sampling. That was the game changer, which provided us with the information to say, look, your body is really responding to this atmosphere, not in a good way.
Yeah. You're clearly still enjoying this. I get a real sense that that this is a passion for you at this stage. You've been involved in this area for all the way back to Southampton days, really. You would work with Stephen Holgate at some point.
I didn't work with Stephen, but I was sort of, he was in the hospital and I was over in the main university. Yeah. But I got to Southampton on what was called then a New Blood lectureship. This was a time in Maggie Thatcher's era when a lot of the universities had been starved of money, and the academic people were getting older and older, and there wasn't any new people coming in the bottom of the system. So they set up this New Blood scheme, New Blood lectureship scheme, and I was able to con my way into one of these lectureships. It really was, because the lectureship I got was in free radical biology. Wow. And this was a new area of science. Yeah. And I remember going along, well, first of all, I remember seeing the advert for the job. I went into the university library. I was in Sussex at the time, University of Sussex. And I read up about free radicals over the weekend. I went to the interview on the Monday as a free radical expert. And at the interview, I was asked, what area of free radical biology are you going to initiate? And I said, I'm going to look at a disease called bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which is a respiratory disease in premature babies. And they get this because to keep them alive, we have to intubate them and give them extra oxygen. So you and I are breathing 21%.
Yeah.
But often if the baby's very premature, they might be getting 80% oxygen. And at that level, it will be producing free radicals.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I did that.
Unintended consequences.
I did that. Stephen was doing his asthma work. I was doing the preterm baby work. And, but as they were both lung related. So we knew each other. We came together. And he was a great mentor as well to me at the time.
I bet you had no idea that jumping into that, blagging your way in all those years ago, like still here sat today, still talking about radicals and air and lungs, like it's opened up a whole career and life of research.
Well, I spent a very good 6-7 years in Southampton, and then I was headhunted to come to London to St Thomas's Hospital, and I was given accommodation in Victoria to begin with, and every morning I would walk down Victoria Street and across Waterloo Bridge into St Thomas's Hospital. And quite quickly, I was getting my hanky out and blowing my nose and seeing, this black suit, and my chest would be tightening up. And very quickly, I moved from oxidative lung injury in preterm babies to the impacts of London air quality.
Were you literally drawing those mental dots live? I mean, was that effectively what was happening, your exposure to London pollution with what you knew?
Yeah, I wondered what was doing this. So then I thought, well, what's in London's air? And there were a couple of people measuring that at the time in the old City Hall. And I looked at these. There was nitrogen dioxide, a free radical. And there was particles which had transition metals on them which generate free radicals. And then I started at St Thomas's, I started doing some work with ozone, this really powerful oxidant. And before I knew it, I thought in 2003, I published an article saying that ambient air pollution is causing all these diseases because of free radical challenge. NO2 is a free radical, ozone produces free radicals, particulate matter can produce free radicals. They're all doing it with the same mechanism.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It's the same mechanism for all of them.
Yeah. And imagine if you've got a combination of those in the air you're breathing.
Do you think at some point we will have a different metric for pollution beyond then the size, that we'll actually be talking about today's a high oxidative potential day? Like, is that do you see that as a potential trajectory? That
Absolutely.
We have we've got information being presented to us in a way that tells us that, because we were talking about, commercial kitchens being the highest producer of PM now in central London, but it may not have the same harm footprint. So it may not need the same warning. It may be the highest pollutant, but it may be a different thing. So do you kind of see that as a potential trajectory for our futures, that we start to express our risk in a different way than we are?
Ultimately, yes, that is the goal, because that will allow better regulation and allow us to not worry about entities which we don't, are not having an impact on our health. So what we've been doing is we've been, instead of measuring oxidative potential of particles or gases in the laboratory, where we have to bring samples from outside, inside. Maybe we don't get to work with them straight away because it's the end of the day and we've got to wait, or maybe we don't want to work at the weekend. What we've got to do is to have an instrument which allows us to measure free radical activity of the air instantaneously, or at least every minute or so, and to give us real-time data. And that's what we now have a prototype for. And that's what we are setting up and now have funding to make more of these instruments, and to really, ultimately what we need to do is to link that data with health data. And that, based on our history, we know that will take some time. So we need to build up a database of real-time oxidative potential, and then we need to relate that to the health of a cohort of people.
But you've had a hell of a laboratory for the last decade or so, working with the GLA in London and looking at the impacts and linking health to pollution and so on. So you've got a phenomenal roadmap. You've got a sense of what the stepping stones look like.
Absolutely.
To do this, which is incredibly important.
And the people who can do it.
Yeah. Phenomenal. Frank, it's been brilliant chatting to you this morning. The really fascinating conversation. Air quality is like this onion. You keep peeling back another layer and going, oh my God, there's another layer to this. It really is the subject matter that keeps giving from an interest perspective. Yeah, unfortunately. But it's a phenomenal topic. Look, thanks so much for your time. It was really great chatting to you today. Thanks.
Pleasure, Simon.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you like this show and can think of other people that might like it too, please do spread the word and let's keep building this community. If you can check 5 stars, I'd really appreciate that. Apparently, it really helps with the reach on some of these platforms that you're listening to it on. And of course, like and subscribe if that's possible too. Do check out our YouTube channel. There's plenty going on over there as well. These episodes are not possible without our sponsors. So thanks a million to Particles Plus, Eurovent, ACO and Farmwood. Without them, this just simply is not possible. So see you again next week.